Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to talk about a story that has been making headlines in Australia. And honestly, it's one of those cases that makes you stop and think about the justice system, the legal processes, and the real-life consequences of such decisions. So what's going on? Well, a teenager who was convicted of murdering a Queensland mother, Emma Lovell, during a Boxing Day home invasion has had his sentence reduced by the state's highest court. That's a pretty shocking development, right? Let me break this down for you. Let's set the scene. Emma Lovell was a mother, a wife, and a person who, like many of us, was just trying to live her life. On Boxing Day in 2022, she and her husband, Lee Lovell, were at home in North Lakes, Queensland, when a group of teenagers broke into their home. Now, I know what you're thinking. What kind of person would do something like that on a holiday, especially when it's a family home? Well, the answer is someone who was 17 at the time, and now he's 20. But the real question is, why was his sentence reduced, and what does that mean for the victims' families and the justice system as a whole? So the original sentence was 14 years in custody, with 70% of that sentence being non-parole. That means the killer would have had to serve 9.8 years before being eligible for release. However, the Queensland Court of Appeal overturned that decision, reducing the non-parole period to 60% of the sentence. That means he'll be eligible for release after serving about 8 years and 5 months, which is a significant reduction in the time he'll spend in custody. The court stated that the original sentencing judge's description of the crime as particularly heinous wasn't supported by the evidence, leading to a misapplication of sentencing principles. Okay, so the court is saying that the original judge was too harsh in their assessment of the crime's severity, but how does that align with the facts of the case? Let me go back to the details. The attack was a home invasion, and the teenager was armed with a knife. Emma and her husband tried to push the teens out the front door, but the boy lashed out, stabbing Emma in the chest and puncturing her heart. She collapsed on the lawn and died despite efforts to save her. Her husband was also seriously injured, right? So why did the court think the crime wasn't particularly heinous? Well, the court looked at the evidence and found that the original judge's description of the crime didn't match the facts. So maybe the original judge was too quick to label the crime as the worst possible scenario, but the appeal court found that the evidence didn't support that level of severity. Let's talk about the mitigating factors that the court considered. The teenager had pleaded guilty early, showed signs of remorse, and was willing to rehabilitate. Additionally, the court acknowledged that he had a disadvantaged upbringing, which might have contributed to his actions. These factors, the court argued, were enough to justify the reduced sentence. But here's the thing. When someone commits a crime like this, especially a violent one that results in death, can mitigating factors really outweigh the severity of the crime? I mean, yes, the legal system does take into account factors like remorse and willingness to rehabilitate, but when someone takes a life, does that not carry a certain weight that can't be easily dismissed? I want to be clear here. This isn't about dismissing the importance of rehabilitation or the need to consider the circumstances of the offender. I think it's important that the justice system does look at all factors, including the background of the offender. But when a crime is as violent as this and it results in the death of a mother and the serious injury of her husband, it's hard not to feel that the sentence reduction is too lenient. The court's decision is based on the evidence, and they've said that the original judge's description of the crime was not supported by the facts. But does that mean that the crime wasn't heinous, or does it just mean that the evidence didn't support the label of particularly heinous that was applied in the original sentencing? This is a really complex issue. On one hand, the teenager is young, and the court is considering his potential for rehabilitation. On the other hand, the victims' families are left to grapple with the fact that the person who took their loved one's life will be released earlier than expected. It's a tough balance, and the legal system has to weigh a lot of different factors. But I can't help but wonder, what message does this send to the public? Does it send a message that violent crimes, even those that result in death, can be punished less severely if certain conditions are met? And how does that affect the victims' families who have already gone through the unimaginable loss of a loved one? I think it's also worth noting that the teenager was 17 at the time of the crime. In Queensland, the maximum non-parole period for a juvenile is 70% of the sentence, which in this case was 14 years. So the original sentence was already within the legal limits for juvenile offenders. However, the appeal court found that the non-parole period was too long given the evidence. So they reduced it to 60%, which is still a significant amount of time. But again, the question is whether that's enough, especially when the crime was so brutal and resulted in a death, and they were attacked in their own home. Emma died from her injuries, and Lee was seriously injured. This is a tragedy that no one should have to go through, and now the family has to deal with the knowledge that the person who took Emma's life will be released in 2031. That's a long time, but it's still a reality they have to face. It's not just about the sentence length, it's about the pain and suffering that the family has endured, and the fact that the person responsible will be back in society sooner than expected, which is a key principle in juvenile justice systems. However, in cases where the crime is as severe as this, there's a fine line between rehabilitation rehabilitation and justice for the victims. The court has to balance these two aspects, and in this case, they've chosen to prioritize the potential for rehabilitation, even though the crime was brutal and resulted in a death, and it's not guaranteed. Just because someone shows remorse and is willing to rehabilitate doesn't mean they won't commit another crime. That's a real concern, especially when the person is released back into society after serving a significant portion of their sentence. The court is making a decision based on the law, but the families of the victims are left with the reality that the person who took their loved one's life will be back in the world in a few years. What's the takeaway here? Well, it's a reminder that the justice system is complex and decisions are made based on a lot of factors. It's also a reminder that sometimes, even when the law is applied, the outcomes can be difficult to accept, especially for the victims' families. It's a tough situation, and I don't think there's a clear answer, but I do think it's important to have these conversations, to understand the legal processes, and to consider the impact on all parties involved. This case is a reflection of the broader challenges in the justice system, particularly when dealing with young offenders who have committed violent crimes. It's a balance between rehabilitation and punishment, and it's a balance that the court has to make, but it's also a balance that affects real people, real families, and real lives. And that's something that we can't ignore, no matter how complex the legal system may be. While the court's decision may be based on the evidence and the law, it's a decision that will have lasting effects on the victims' families and on the broader community. It's a reminder that the justice system is not perfect, and that sometimes, even when the law is followed, the outcomes can be difficult to accept. But it's also a reminder that we need to continue to have these conversations, to understand the system, and to advocate for a balance that serves both the needs of the victims and the potential for rehabilitation of the offenders. This case is a complicated one, and it highlights the challenges of the justice system when dealing with violent crimes committed by young offenders. It's a case that will continue to be discussed, debated, and analyzed, and it's a case that reminds us of the importance of considering all perspectives when making decisions about justice and rehabilitation.